Welcome everyone to the event Risk Analysis as Political, How Gender and Race Matter in the Constitution of Crisis in EU Border Management. My name is Hannah Mühlenhoff. I'm Assistant Professor of European Studies with a focus on Europe in the World at the University of Amsterdam. And this event was made possible by the Amsterdam Center for European Study, ACES, in cooperation with the University of Vienna and the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. And I would already like to send a big thank you to Lisa Sares from ACES for her technical support here. This event is also the kick-off of a longer new series of ACES called Gender and Sexuality in European Geopolitics, a cooperation between the Europe in the World theme and the Diverse Europe theme, which will be coordinated by myself. And I'm very happy to see this many here, so we can also already introduce you to this new series and point you to our webpage. The next event will be on the 19th of November on gender equality in EU external relations with, amongst others, Tony Hastrup and Anna van der Vleuten. And on the 10th of December, there will be another event on pushback against the Istanbul Convention. And you can find them on our website. But now I would like to introduce you to our excellent speakers for today. The first one is Saskia Stachowitsch, who will talk about her research. She is the Scientific Director for International Affairs and Professor in International Relations at the University of Vienna, and her research interests are critical security and military studies, feminist and post-colonial theories in international relations, the privatization of security, private military and security companies, and EU border security focused on transnational actors like Frontex, which is what she will talk about today. And we also have an excellent discussant from the UvA itself, Rocco Bellanova. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and his research is mainly focused on European data-driven security practices and the role played by data protection in their governance. And his work sits at the intersection of politics, law, science, and technology studies. It's great to have you, Saskia and Rocco. This event was supposed to actually take place on site in March, but I think we were just discussing, it could have maybe taken place if it had been a week earlier, but it had to be canceled. But it's great that we could organize it this way now. So we will start with Saskia's presentation, which will be around 20 minutes, and that will be followed by a discussion by Rocco. And then we will have a brief response by Saskia, and we are also looking forward to the questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A box on the Zoom interface to send us your questions, which I will then pass on to our speakers. Saskia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to be speaking in the context of this great center with all the wonderful online and on-site events that have been coming from you. I'm also very honored to be the first in the gender and sexuality series, which I think is a very worthwhile and important topic. Before I talk about my work, I do want to give recognition to Julia Sachs, Eda, and Clemens Binder, who did most of this work together with me, and they're also hopefully here and can probably pitch in the discussion later on. My work, generally, I'm always interested in how notions of security and insecurity are gendered and racialized, how this transforms with the way security provision is organized, and how it also changes with the actors that are involved in that. And ultimately, how this is linked to insecurities for and violences against those that are usually not at the center of security analysis. And border security certainly is an interesting and important topic in this regard. And for the EU, Frontex is at the heart of many of these questions. I'm sure most of you know this is the agency that is in charge of the EU's comprehensive approach of integrated border management. They're conducting land, sea, and air operations within the Schengen area, and also particularly at the external borders. They're very important actor in returns, in coordinating with third countries, but also in research and development, and also in risk analysis, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And Frontex, of course, is growing. It has seen a tremendous extension in its financial and human resources, and it has also gained more and more powers and additional competencies through particularly two main mandate extensions in 2016 and 2019. And this is an ongoing process, and with the new Pact for Migration and Asylum, I think we see further strengthening of the agency. But Frontex still likes to sometimes portray itself as this neutral platform on which member states coordinate their external border protection. But of course, it doesn't have independent power. And I argue that to a great extent, this independent power comes from its monopoly on knowledge production, and particularly in the area of risk analysis. So what is risk analysis? That is a comprehensive, expansive, standardized process of data collection and evaluation that is detecting and evaluating risks relating to illegal and irregular border crossings, all sorts of cross-border crime, smuggling, this complicated risk analysis model at its heart. And the data comes from Frontex's own activities, it comes from member states, border agencies, it comes from other EU agencies, Europol, it comes from Eurosur, international organizations like the IOM, and so on. And risk analysis is really the one security practice that underlies and accompanies everything that Frontex does. It informs when, where, and how the agency becomes active and operations are conducted. And it is also influential beyond operations and even beyond Frontex in terms of resource allocation, funding decisions, and it has in many ways real consequences for how border policies and practices are designed and implemented. Still, it is often described as a technical, depoliticized tool to discern risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. But as none of you will be particularly surprised, it is, of course, not only an objective assessment of a reality outside of itself, but co-constitutive with it. So to me, risk analysis is best conceptualized as a sense-making security practice that is embedded within societal and political power relations. It defines the meaning of security and the objects of security and the subjects, so who is to be secured from what and by who. Risk analysis generates shared understandings of policy problems. It demands solutions based on these definitions, and it makes normative claims about their appropriateness. It is also defining emergencies and is distinguishing the state of crisis from the normal. Julien Jean-Debeau and Polly Pallister-Wilkins have written about this. So risk analysis makes migration intelligible, and it makes migrants amenable or not to border management and security practices, such as detentions, returns, surveillance, search and rescue. And it is particularly in these risk analysis capabilities that Frontex has grown even exponentially compared to the general growth of the organization in terms of rising budgets and new tools and infrastructures, such as Eurosur and Frontex now being also put in charge and cooperating with third countries. So Frontex's role in making sense of migration through knowledge production has been widened significantly. Now, what role for gender and race in all of this? Well, feminist and post-colonial scholarship have already shown that security practices and policies also, of course, relating, build on gendered and racialized conceptualizations of security, and that this can and often does increase insecurities for those that are defined as irregular for women, for racialized men. And they've also shown that security knowledges and expertise are an important part of that process. So what I and my team are interested in doing is bringing these feminist and post-colonial approaches into conversation with critical security studies, particularly with those that are concerned with security practices and knowledge production in border security, in order to move beyond a simple understanding of security is constructed and toward a deeper understanding of how security practices reproduce concrete, really name them, asymmetries and inequalities. And this, of course, goes very well with the recent ahead around race and racism in critical security studies. And I really do hope, and I think it's important that within these discussions, we don't lose sight of all the important feminist contributions to these topics, and that, you know, an intersectional critical understanding of gender does not get lost within this debate. So what did we do? We looked at the starting point, really, at the annual risk analysis reports, or understanding how the data collected is transformed into the broader narratives that are being presented in those reports. And we looked at the gendered and racialized meanings inherent there, and did a comparative analysis between 2012 and 2019, looking at how did these meanings transform. And we were particularly interested in how gendering and racialization were constitutive of the normalization of notions of crisis. And unsurprisingly, we found that with increasing crisification, gendering and racialization also became more dominant. And we use this idea of crisification. It's very similar to what Jean Lebeau and Pallister Wilkins did with crisis labeling. So looking at the continuous process of how a sense of crisis is invoked, often without labeling as such, and bring this into conversation with feminist and post-colonial work on the productivity of crisis rhetoric, and how this is connected to social inequalities. And this is where I want to show you briefly a few images so that you can see what these reports look like. Sorry, it's not the one. This is what I want to start with. So these are just the cover images of 2013 and 2016. You can already see how the priorities and the main themes of these reports have shifted throughout that period of investigation. I could go into a discussion of border masculinities right now, but bear with me for a moment longer. So these reports, they became more professionalized. They became really, you know, glossy with many photographs, many visualizations, and have changed quite a bit in those 7 to 8 years. We found that there were basically 4 main frames through which migration was understood, and also through which it was crisified. And these were not to do so much with the typical securitized, militarized frames of terrorism and security threats. They were, well, one was mostly around this idea of pressure. And again, Pallister Wilkins has written about this. This idea of Europe being outnumbered and then overrun, the flows, the pressures, the streams of migrants. The second was a growing concern over economic migration and the fear of welfare overstretch. A third, the constitution of a humanitarian crisis. Again, Polly's work comes to mind. And fourth, the idea of knowledge crisis. So a growing concern over the unknownness of migrants. And gender and race mattered in all of those frames, in terms of the stereotypes that were produced, the binaries that were constructed, identity constructions, and how this highlighted but also obscured certain inequalities and insecurities. So what were the gender stereotypes? There was a good deal of masculinization and racialization, producing some migrants as these securitized villains. So the hypermasculine jihadist and the profit-seeking, ruthless people smuggler. But it was actually more dominant was with an increasing crisification, came a shift away from the concern with these illegal activities of migrants towards general gendered and racialized problematization of all migrants as being chaotic, potentially violent, unmanageable by Western security practice. And like I said, a growing concern over the unknownness of migrants. This was very often tied to demands for more data and access to more data. And it was also tied to a biopolitical turn towards the problematization of migrants' bodies. So an increasing concern over their unknown health status and unfamiliar infectious disease. So this is going to be very interesting to monitor moving forward, I think. Here are a few, and this is again from the 2016 report, which interestingly, all the pictures in which border guards interact with migrants in this report show them in clinical uniforms and in this sort of medical attire. So there is a lot of, colonial images of ordering the chaotic, the unknown other that is very often masculinized and racialized. Further, like I already mentioned, this idea of the economic migrant is one of the main frames through which migration is classified over the period of investigation and through which it is linked to masculinized and racialized stereotypes of migrants as undeserving and exploitative. I brought you here one quote that they had, and in the 7 years that we looked at, this was the only time they ever featured the voice of a migrant. And the quote said, some of my friends went to Europe, and when they came back, they had money and they bought cars for their family. So I thought I should do the same. So, and beyond that one incident, there was more and more mentions of economic migrant as young, materialistic men, really saying they were mostly young men, they were single young men, so a concern over masculinity, and these men always being portrayed as having a lot of choice and agency. So they always they opt to migrate, they wish to come to Europe, they decide to take irregular routes. And in opposition to that figure, toward the end of that period that we looked at, the bona fide traveler is introduced. So a legitimate white business traveler, very elusive figure that is juxtaposed with the economic migrant. And this went very often with justifying decreasing incentives to migrate and to arguments that argued returns as a plausible counter-strategy to irregular migration. Then, of course, the humanitarian discourse that is very much tied to what Iris Marion Young has called masculinist protectionism. So migrants as feminized, as vulnerable, as naive, as exploitable. There is sometimes, but not always, an explicit link to women and children. You see this one image as well, and Western border guards as these white male protectors of the feminized other. And very often this is also with regards to what Spivak has called white men saving brown women from brown men. And especially in the beginning of the period, there is sometimes explicit mention of gendered insecurities and violences, so human trafficking and sexual exploitation. But interestingly, as the more dominant the humanitarian frame becomes, the more these specific issues get sidelined in favor of a general victimization and a general feminization of all migrants. And gender and race really work here as a way to bridge what has been described as the a-risk, at-risk paradox, where migrants are simultaneously described as risky and as being at risk. As migrant is the one in need of protection, and the masculinized, racialized is the one that is malicious and exploitative and deceiving. So gender and race are very important in making sense of these dualistic notions of deserving and undeserving, regular, irregular, refugee, and economic migrant. There's also more and more mention throughout this period, more references to European identity and values. Seeing Europe being described as modern, as advanced, as managerial, but also as superior in terms of human rights and also gender equality. And migration then also becomes this threat to the European gender order as progressive. And also more and more space being dedicated to African and Middle Eastern problem spaces, as Lucy Chamblian has described them. So as weak, failed, all these countries of origin and transit, and harboring problematic masculinities, there's also more and more of what Van Houten and Lacey have described as the invasion map. This is also something that's not in the early reports and becomes more and more prominent throughout. What does all of this do? Here I'm particularly inspired by the feminist project of looking for silences, so what is not mentioned. And it is structural inequalities that are mostly disavowed, of course. The object of crisis is always Europe, is European borders, border officers, economies, welfare systems. The crisis of migrants experienced by migrants is obscured, or it is compartmentalized within these humanitarian sections of the report. And victimization of migrants is mostly discussed as a result of violence by other migrants or by the racialized smuggler. Economic motivations are constantly emphasized over war, human rights violation, deprived living situations, and they're individualized, or they're discussed as not in terms of structural constraints, but in terms of individual choice. So the North-South divide, or the European welfare state crisis, or any of these important contexts that are important for seeing migration as crisis are, of course, then not referenced. So in conclusion, gender and race underpinned the identified risks. They assigned differential value, rights, and agency on the basis of perceived dichotomies between masculinity and femininity, European and non-Europeanness. And the solutions that were based on these risk definitions then insisted on the need to know, categorize, manage, detain, and forcefully remove migrants. And there was a complex process of intersectional gendering in which the notion of crisis arose from a specific mix of gendered and racialized stereotypes, binaries, and identity constructions. So crisis narratives really did contribute to a rise in sexist and colonialist representations of migration, migrants, and border issues. And these crisifying moves in risk analysis, they did not emerge out of an objective, state of emergency, or they did also not coincide with what has been, more or less officially called the refugee crisis in media and political debates. They had their roots in earlier reports, and they were progressively inscribed. And I think this has a lot to do with the rising budgets, the widening scope of activities, the professionalization of risk analysis, and also these discourses of self-legitimization in which Frontex engages in the lead up to institutional reforms. And this, of course, has all kinds of limitations. The risk analysis reports, they're really just the end product of a very complex process. And when we look at them, we learn relatively little about how gendered and racialized assumptions get into data gathering, how they inform the process of risk analysis, and then how this is translated into gendered and racialized policies and practices on the ground. What we do get is a sense of we do get the story that is being told and some sense of how this story is constructed on the basis of different kinds of information and data. And of course, what we need at this point is much more field work with an ethnographic sensibility, should this ever be possible again. And yeah, I'm happy to say that the Austrian Science Fund has approved a project in which we will hopefully get to do that in way more depth than I was able to present here. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. That's great news that you got more money to pursue this research. Thank you so much. And I think now Rocco could share his comments in the next couple of minutes. And the audience is invited to leave some questions for us in the Q&A box in the meantime.
First of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Hannah, for organizing this series. Thank you, Saskia, for your presentation. And thank you, Lisa, for all your organization in setting up the meeting and the following meetings too. And I would like to start with the obvious. And I think that the obvious is that Saskia's work, together with Hannah's work and other colleagues' works, show the importance of this kind of approaches to the study of European politics. And I'm thinking in particular to many working within the framework of EU studies and sometimes also dealing with the same research objects or what looks apparently the same research object. There has been work on reporting on Frontex, obviously, and so on. I think that this conversation with what happens on the fringe, so to say, of EU studies is very important. And so for me, this is the first things to underline, and is never enough to repeat that, I think. So thank you, Saskia, for your presentation and for your work. I think it's very important for our students and for us in how we approach European politics and what we understand by European politics. Then a second thank you concern your contribution to the conversation around critical approaches to security. And probably my first question is a little bit to further unpack what you say when you speak about going beyond the classical understanding of security as socially constructed. And maybe to come back to that, I think is something I'm curious to hear more about it. And my third point concern a little bit the kind of parallels between your work and the work that I'm carrying out with other colleagues, especially Georgios Glovstius, with whom we are working on the Schengen information systems. And I think that we are also increasingly attracted by the added value of in our case, feminist technoscience, and how feminist STS has been caring for years about what Maria Puig de la Bella Garza called neglected things. And so shifting in terms of not only approach, but also which kind of research object, which kind of research politics that we want to deploy when we focus on question of insecurity. And in our case, the connection is again with some forms of risk analysis, but kind of risk analysis we are thinking are more the risk analysis that are carried out on the border in terms of security action algorithms and so on. And our decision has been to go as you do with work on risk analysis on Frontex to focus on the underpinnings. So what goes into the preparatory steps, all this I will call it janitorial to some extent work that underpins the fact that we are using risk analysis either as a policy tool to gain traction and disseminate frames and discourses, or as specific action to be taken in specific instances. And it can be at the border, it can be on reception center, it can be in front of expulsion, so in different other places. And I believe that there is much more to be done, as you were saying, in terms of how those actors are caring for their own actions. And so what does it mean that we also have to care for those actions? How do we care for the data that are stored in database? And this element about what Georgios called the maintenance process and the fragility of this database and of this security mechanism and tools, I believe, are becoming more and more important and are also opening up the politics. I'm thinking about Annick Wieben works about the need to use feminist and the post-colonial approaches to things that what we are witnessing is not something that is going to happen by default, that we can open up a space of intervention. And so my second question to you is, what is your thinking and project in terms of research politics? How your stepping stone research on risk analysis can bring us closer to create space of political intervention? Is this the goal that we have to embrace? And what feminist approach can teach us in that sense? My third question is about the methodology. This is something you were mentioning at the end. I'm very happy too, and congratulations for the funding. But how to carry out this ethnographic work? What are the kind of challenges that you are witnessing, and which kind of challenges you expect you and your colleague to face when getting into this very sensitive field? I will stop for now here, and I will be happy to join later. Thank you again.
Thank you, Rocco, so much for these excellent questions. Maybe I can add one little question. I was wondering about this connection between the increasing use of visualizations in this kind of risk assessment report that, in a sense, implies some sort of objectivity, because it's this idea of risk analysis and collecting data, how does that go together, or why is there this move towards more visualizations? Maybe you have some reflections on that, because I think we see this a lot also in other publications of the EU, but to also include it in this kind of document seems also very interesting to me. So Saskia, you have a couple of minutes to respond.
Thank you. I was scribbling on my notepad ferociously. I hope I did get, for sure I did not get all the aspects of that. But thank you, Rocco. Thank you so much for engaging with my work and coming up with these great comments and questions. I appreciate what you say about, the fringes of EU studies and how we can, remake the field in certain ways. And I'm all for this. Because it can't go on much longer that EU studies remain so much outside of many of these critical debates. So I think that's a very worthwhile project, and I'm inspired by all of the work that you mentioned, the work that you do, and within all of those colleagues of yours. So yeah, this is, I think, spatial politics in EU studies that is going on here. How can we go beyond security, understanding security is socially constructed? Well, my feeling is that this has been sort of the common sense. It's socially constructed. So now we don't have to talk anymore about, what is the actual content of that, and how does that social construction enable the upkeep of power? And while there has been great interest in, how power works with the Foucauldian concept, very elusive understanding of power and the different actors that are being involved, there's great work being done. But to me, there's always this last little bit where I would like to know, but which power relations? Who dominates over who in that context, and how is that enabled by security practices? So I think this is where these two strands could come together quite well. And we need to know all that about, the infrastructures and the data process and all of that. But in the end, I think we also need to know the stories that are being constructed on the basis of that, and how they enable domination of others. And to me, this whole notion of knowledge and power also, it really needs that post-colonial spin that says knowledge practices sustain oppressive practices. They are oppressive practices in a certain way, and then also name these oppressions and how they're being deducted, if you will, from the knowledge practices. So this is what drives me in all of that. And I do appreciate this idea that there is no data so minor that it is innocent, right? So there's everything that we collect, every little piece of data has that political context always. But I think a lot of work goes into making that political context into something politically. So taking the data and then selling the political solution that you derive from that to different audiences, I think that's a narrative process, a process of storytelling, and that's why I think all the feminist approaches towards narrative and discourse are relevant here. I reread your article on the care and maintenance for data, and I was very interested in that. And it would be, for example, great to unpack this further. What kind of gendered understanding of labor division goes into thinking about caring for data? This is really like household chores compared to the more masculinized labor that is being done with and to this data. So I think that there could be another level of gender analysis that would be very worthwhile. I don't know what would be the outcome, but I would certainly be interested. Yeah, what kind of political interventions? This does not look so hopeful, I think, but I think what we can do and should do is challenge this idea that we can have an apolitical discussion around these issues and apolitical solutions, and that we can stop making Frontex into this catch-all solution that all politicians now go to because they are buying into, or they want that sort of unpolitical, technological, neutral understanding of what the agency does. And yeah, this might not be very fruitful in considering the new pact now, but I think that's the first intervention that is definitely necessary. Methodology, well, you all know this better than me, because basically I'm a newcomer to border security. I've worked in feminist security studies for a long time, but only really just starting to engage with this particular field. I have Clement's been a PhD student of mine, is doing interviews with all sorts of officials in the border security architecture, and his experience was that actually people do want to talk about various things, and it's not so secretive that you cannot get access. So I think the first thing that I would try to do is now talk to people and see what they think risk is, what they understand, their self-understanding of what they're doing. I don't expect this to be very difficult. I expect it to be much more difficult to really see the process and what is being done to data and how this is being turned into the stories that we're talking about. And I think we have a whole set of COVID-related fieldwork challenges now that certainly need addressing. Hannah's questions about the use of visuals. I don't know this, and this would be one thing I would definitely start asking people. Why do you put that in your reports more and more? Why do you think that? I think it does have to do with the resources you have for that kind of reporting. I think that's really a sign of having a big apparatus of people coming up with these maps, putting them together. I think that's one part of the reason, and the other, I think, is that these reports also become politically more relevant and important, and publicly important. This is one of the few things that Frontex puts out there for everybody to see. So I think it has to do with the idea that we can convince easily with those visualizations, and that they, again, make innocent sense of what is going on.
Yes, thank you so much. We have quite some very interesting questions here. I will try to pass them on. The first question comes from Leonie Jeren, and she says, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering whether you have some thoughts on the Africa Frontex risk analysis cells that are currently set up in many West African border police headquarters, and to what extent they may contribute to the externalization of the gendered racialized categories of risk framing beyond the EU. And maybe together, if it works with the next question, which is on the categories from Eline Verb, did you see any other changes over time in the discourse in these reports, for instance, in terms of categories or terms such as illegal migrant, irregular arrivals, etc.? That's also something I was interested in, what these categories, how these categories are constructed, and what this can tell us also about kind of the change in policies and its consequences.
Mm-hmm. Well, to the first question, I cannot speak about these particular cells as such, or what they're doing, but I think they're part of, also with the new pact on migration and asylum, this idea that there's a streamlining of risk analysis, understandings of risks, and streamlining that into one infrastructure, also with Eurosur, and making that into a whole package of understanding risk. So this is certainly a standardization and also some sort of expansionist framework, if you will, where we not only have partners in third countries to engage in that with us, but also to translate the EU's understanding of risk into their own doings, because I think as much as politicians might like to think that externalization is such an easy way to go and an easy solution for all the problems, we have seen that it's not, and there's all kinds of actors engaging in that kind of work that can have very problematic outcomes for the EU. So I think it's in the interest of this externalized, and it is also growing, this externalized border security architecture, that there is a further ingrainment of a standardized, harmonized understanding of what risk is to the EU, basically, and to also transport that to the partners engaged there. What was the second one? That was about the general trends.
Yeah, whether there's a change in terms of, for instance, the categories that they use in the analysis. Talking about migrants.
I don't have any real data on irregular and illegal migration, how that changed over time. I can say that this idea of economic migration is not present in the earlier reports. I think 2014, 15 is when this idea is first made into a concept. The ideas are there earlier, but the concepts are being used differently, and like I said, the bona fide traveler is also a figure that comes in at a later point. Throughout all the reports, the security frame is not so strong as you would expect. Terrorism, for example, is discussed really little, and in the early reports, it's really just a very small section. And even in the later reports, you have issues like health or violence, much more prominent, much more space in terrorism. So these typical security issues I found were rather minor in comparison to others, of course. And the humanitarianism, that of course becomes stronger. It's there from the beginning, but this dramatic language and this sense of emergency and catastrophe and a lot of comparisons to World War and things like that, that only comes in with 2014, and then 2015 is where this hits really, where we have much more dramatic language. And also this comes in with the change that they have the director write the foreword. So the executive director Frontex now writes his own, forward to that. And this is mostly where the hard-hitting securitizing and dramatic language comes in. So it's often in the layout of the report that changes the overall content. So do you have, for example, a huge section on countries of origin, which is not in the earlier reports. It comes in the later reports. So automatically you will have pages and pages of discussing those problematic regions where migrants come from. And this then changes the whole feel of the report in the end. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here.
Yeah, there's some more questions for you. There's one question from Laura Clayton. She asked whether you could reflect a bit more on how your work on risk analysis would link to the politics of sight and visibility in the Mediterranean, such as the work by Tazioli and Walters, and how is being visible in terms of Frontex operations deciding who to intercept, rescue, put their gaze on, and in relation to think about this in relation to race and gender.
I'm not 100% sure what this question gets at. Is this about who we see or who we really see in terms of surveillance? Or
I would interpret the question. Yes, she writes yes. Okay, then I'll just leave it there. So okay. Surveillance.
Well, I think, the idea that one has to know what is going on is tied to these gendered and racialized understandings. So Frontex does not see everything, and it also does not want to see everything and can't see everything. This is why it has the whole risk idea. It has the risk idea so that it can know when there is something going on at the border that is worthwhile Frontex operation. So there will be a lot of border crossings and things that they will not be interested in. And this is generally EU thing, right? To look at where is the greatest risk and where can we put the resources, when and how is this a European problem? And I think this is where risk analysis comes in with these categories. So what kind of activity do we even have to surveil? What is a risky movement, and in relationship to what? Because they say risk is something that will negatively affect the internal and the external security of the EU. Well, again, this is a huge, a spectrum of things that could be that. But I think just the idea to think of what kind of border do we surveil, with what kind of technologies, when is it necessary for Frontex to even be interested and have an operation, all of that is where gender and race are already included. Maybe Rocco can add.
Rocco, yes, please.
Yeah, if I can join, because actually it's something that really struck me, your use of images in your presentation. I remember that 6-7 years ago, while I was working on Eurosur, we were doing something similar using a PowerPoint of a representative from the European Commission and remixing it, like using it our own PowerPoint presentation and resignifying it to some extent. And back then it was more about a quadrillage, like creating a kind of a square with a specific way in which the Mediterranean Sea will have been patrolled and information gathered, assembled, and so on. So it was different kind of visuals, and this made me reflect about the fact that there are different tactics of visualization and different audiences also at play. And as you were saying, like the interesting part of risk analysis is that it co-produces different political situation at the border and political situation in the European Parliament, to oversimplify. And different images are produced, and what strikes me always is that Frontex has always had this difficult relation to data protection, being accused of not respecting data protection, defending themselves by saying that they are not dealing in personal data. And finally, images are very personal, like images that they give back. There is this striking difference between aggregating information about patterns and giving a face to them, and very racialized, genderized, driven images of this. So I think that different forms of visualization and seeing are at play, and not only one. And my second comment is the fact that we should also be aware of not falling into the visual trap. There are other forms of surveillance that are very, very different from the visual ones that are at play. And the digital nature of information, as Rune Sagman note, allows for different forms of communication and knowledge narration that do not rely on our understanding of visualization.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. I think generally this idea of the unknown migrant as someone who's also indistinguishable to the Western eye. So we have to have additional data to make sure, because we don't know them, we can't distinguish them, and we also cannot, and they're also are deceiving us. So it's not only that we don't know, but they're also lying about who they are. So this, I think, is a very colonial idea, and in the reports this idea is then always linked to, like I said, asking for more data, asking for more access to data. And then this is also towards the later reports, becomes a vehicle for arguing for a generally enlarged role of Frontex. So there is a line between these colonial representations and the idea that if we have like a data based, knowledge based border, if we want to have that, we need to have Frontex in charge of all of that. We need them to have access to everything, and we need them actually to be, to have the central role that I think they're slowly but surely also getting.
Also connected to this, I would like to pose two more questions that also come from the audience. The first one is related to the consequences of such racialized gender discourses in the reports. And Mariana Kliasi asked here whether this has any, whether this kind of risk analysis can be linked to the legal responsibility and accountability of the agency. And also in relation to that, I was thinking, does it lead to kind of an increasing militarism in the Frontex response and Frontex actions? And I'm also thinking of the news we had last week on relating to the pushbacks that Frontex was involved in. So what are the consequences of these discourses? And then there's another question by Maria Diana about the women, peace and security agenda to you, Saskia, and she's asking whether we see any parallels between the language of the Frontex reports and the WPS discourse. Do we see a cooptation of feminist ideas and language around the women, peace and security agenda and EU border and security practices? Maybe also for me to add, do we see any reference at all to the women, peace and security agenda in these reports?
Okay, well, these are big questions for a few more minutes, but I'll give my best. Well, first, consequences. Well, it's hard to really make that connection, and I think we haven't completely yet. But I think we can already say that this kind of understanding of who is, you know, human and who's less than, and who can be treated with what kind of border practices is a gendered and racialized issue, and it puts people, mostly everybody, you know, who's understood as irregular, of course, everybody who's understood to be illegal, women, but of course not only women, but also racialized men at greater risks. And the human rights issues that we're seeing with all of this, I think, are on our minds every day. And that, even though there is a growing concern, you know, over gender mainstreaming in border management, anti-discrimination efforts. So we're seeing that sort of language, at least, developing. And this leads me to the last question about the women, peace and security agenda. Until now, I haven't seen any direct mention of that in the risk analysis reports. This is certainly so far not understood as a relevant context. I know that even the scholarly debate is only starting now to argue that border security should be much more included in the women, peace and security agenda, also with the EU now having its strategy and action plan and everything out throughout last year. But I think what we're seeing, and another PhD student of mine, Madita Erdmann, she's also here, is writing about this growing concern over vulnerability. And that's the big gender entry point, I would say, of many border actors. This idea that we can know and identify who's, you know, most vulnerable. And then, of course, try to make this group as small as absolutely possible. But this concept of vulnerability, I think that's very interesting because it works in so many ways. You know, it's the vulnerable border, it's the vulnerable system, it's the vulnerable migrant, and it's particularly vulnerable women and children. So this is a gender discourse that can be applied, you know, to women as much as to European territoriality, and that's kind of scary in its own right. Legal accountability, well, very difficult, I would say, because this is a very elusive, well, legal accountability, I think, is much easier to apply to the most visible scandals that we're seeing. You know, can they engage in pushbacks or anything like that, or have they? And that's, as hard as that is, you can name that problem, and I think partly also prosecute. But with risk analysis, it's going to be very difficult because it has the standard as a very neutral, objective, scientific thing that is hard to make scrutinizable, if you will, by public authority. And also it has this lock-in effect. We haven't really spoken about that, but risk analysis, Frontex has this operational cycle, and it says it starts with risk analysis, and then you have the planning of the operation, you have the operation, and then everything from the operation, all the data, all the knowledge, lessons learned, evaluations, then goes back into risk analysis. So risk analysis is the end and the beginning of everything that Frontex does. So there is a significant risk that understandings that go into risk analysis then we cannot get rid of them anymore, because they become so ingrained in the whole institutional logics of how operations work. Militarism, militarization, I think that's so many people have already shown that this is definitely going on at the borders in various ways. And I think the question is not, is it happening or not? The question is, what does it go with? You know, how much managerial, how much securitized, how much militarized, how much humanitarian discourse, and how does this all tie in with each other? I think the two main trends, and this is not only for border security, but the two main things that militarize are technology. You know, increasing reliance on technology always, or almost always, leads to more militarized approaches. And the second is the actors that are involved. And for example, externalization is a main driver of militarization, because it brings in actors that work with a military mindset and that are probably even paramilitary, or they bring in professionalized security companies that are also heavily militarized. And again, linking back to the issue of technology, this is very often classical military contractor firms that are now selling their technologies in the context of border security. And the more technology goes into risk analysis, the more likely I think it is also to be militarized.
Thank you so much. We see there is a need for much more research and for following these developments. Well, thank you very much to you, Saskia, for joining us today here virtually, and also to you, Rocco, for your questions and contributions. I think it was a really timely discussion. And I would also like to thank Lisa again for her support, and draw your attention again to the new series on gender and sexuality in European geopolitics. Lisa just posted a link to our website where you can also sign up for our newsletter regarding the series. And actually the next event connects very well to what we talked about today, because it will be about the question of gender equality in EU external relations in times of so-called crisis. So there we will also kind of look a bit into how this crisification impacts on questions of gender and sexuality, and also intersectionality in EU external relations. Again, thank you very much, Saskia and Rocco, and thank you to the audience for the great questions and for being with us today. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
That's great.